Hello, and welcome to our lecture on monetary and fiscal policy. So this is an expansion or an extension of what we learned regarding the ADAS model. We're actually going to get into this idea of increasing output in the economy through either a central bank action or a government action. Monetary policy, central bank; fiscal policy, government. We're going to analyze the effects of monetary policy in a closed and open economy. Essentially, we're going to analyze three different scenarios for monetary policy: closed economy, open economy with a flexible exchange rate, and then open economy with a fixed exchange rate. Then we're going to go through these three scenarios again, looking at fiscal policy. Before we get into our specific analysis of those situations, three situations for monetary policy, three situations for fiscal policy, we're going to take a look at or review active stabilization. So at the end of last week's lecture, we talked about active stabilization. Should the government, central bank, government or central bank intervene in the economy? We learned that when there were small business fluctuations, there's no reason for active stabilization. We also learned that during expansions, there was definitely no reason for government or central bank intervention. However, there are arguments that would, that would support the idea of intervening during large contractions, i.e., recessions or depressions. So recall from before, we talked about leaving the economy alone, i.e., I would just say this is where the government or central bank does nothing, which means that it is up to the citizens ultimately to bring that economy back to its natural level of output. And how this happens is that the citizens will essentially take wage increases that are smaller than they would have been in the past. Right? So instead of actually taking a raise every year of 6%, you agree to a raise of only 2%. And in this process, when we are in a recession, the AS is going to slowly return back, basically increase and bring us back to a long run equilibrium. Right. So this is one of the reasons why many economists consider the aggregate supply curve to be a labor supply curve, because it shifts. In most cases, it is shifting because of nominal wages. Now, during a expansion, that aggregate supply curve actually shifts reasonably quickly. And this is because during an expansion, output is high and there's not a lot of unemployment. So this is a great time for the best workers to actually get raises. They'll ask for a raise and they're very likely to get it. Businesses are going to be quite amenable to giving out wage increases because they don't want to lose their employees, especially their best employees. It's also a boom time or an expansion, and therefore business is good. Giving out raises is not going to be a serious issue. Now, as we saw during the contraction side of things, this is when our production is lower than what we would consider the natural level of production. Uh, that aggregate supply curve is going to shift slowly uh, compared to when we're in an expansion. So during this contraction, there is an argument to actually intervene in the economy. So this would be through monetary policy by the central bank or through fiscal policy by the government. And what happens when we engage in any sort of active stabilization is that the aggregate demand curve is going to shift. And this brings us back to that long run equilibrium. This shift is going to occur much quicker than an AS curve shift would otherwise do. So this is a good thing in the fact that we're going to get people back to work quickly. And so rather than have long periods of unemployment waiting for that aggregate supply curve to shift, we are going to get the economy back on track quickly, increase production, and get people back to work. Now, this unfortunately is going to cause inflation. So here we have the trade-off, which we talked about at the very beginning of the term. We have the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. We can reduce unemployment, but it's going to uh, bring about inflation. And here we have some of the Canadian data over time. Of course, we see this thin black line, which is going through the red line. Now, the thin black line, of course, is our natural level of production, Y bar. And the red line, we can actually see some semblance, some resemblance to a business cycle. We see we go up a bit, down a bit, up a bit, down a bit throughout this entire period. We see that in the 80s and the 90s, there are two large contractions, and we will learn that these two large contractions were actually due to disinflation. Recall from earlier, disinflation is when we reduce the inflation rate. Perhaps instead of having a 10% inflation rate, we would like to reduce inflation to 4%. Again, we see the relationship, the trade off between unemployment and inflation. We can reduce inflation, but that is going to cause unemployment. So these are two things that arguably one might be better than the other depending on the situation, right? So we also see that in the 90s. During the 90s, we also had a disinflation. The central bank tried to get inflation to 0%. So it was at 4%, and they tried to reduce it down to 0%. So disinflation caused unemployment. So some of the keys that we have here in our analysis is that the classical dichotomy is no longer in effect. Remember that we are now in the short run. The classical dichotomy applies to the long run. Recall, the classical dichotomy is where we say nominal variables only affect nominal variables. This is why when we did our long run analysis, we saw that increasing the money supply, nominal, did nothing except for increasing the price level. Again, nominal. Inflation, which is nominal, increased the nominal interest rate. Right? So nominal variables do not affect real variables in the long run. However, in the short run, nominal variables do affect real variables. So the money market affects the real interest rate. When we increase the money supply, it really means that money becomes less expensive, right? The price of money is lower. Well, what is the price of money? The price of money is the interest rate. So when we increase that amount of money in the economy, well, then it's everywhere. Right? Hey, there's a lot of money around. Can I borrow some? Sure, we've got lots. The price is going to be low. So this is our interest rate effect. This is the most important thing that we are analyzing in our ADAS model. Now, since we're actually looking at a detailed analysis of active stabilization, we are simply asking the question, are we able to shift the aggregate demand curve? I want to know, will active stabilization work? i.e., can I shift the aggregate demand curve? So we don't need to include the long run aggregate supply in our diagram, and we don't need to include the aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply in our model. Right? We're simply going to use the aggregate demand curve on its own. What we're going to find when we actually go through all of these examples. So recall, we're going to look at monetary policy in a closed economy, in a small open economy with a flexible exchange rate, and in a small open economy with a fixed exchange rate. We're also going to look at fiscal policy in the closed, small open, flexible, and small open, fixed. So we're going to look at all 6 of these situations, and what we're going to find is that the fiscal policy, when we are dealing with a small open economy with a flexible exchange rate, this does not work. Right? So we're not actually able to, get that aggregate demand curve to increase under these conditions. And this is because we're going to ultimately get what we call crowding out of investment and crowding out of net exports. So that is the reason why fiscal policy in a small open economy with a flexible exchange rate does not work. Crowding out of investment, crowding out of net exports. When we look at monetary policy, we see that it is not going to work when we have a small open economy with a fixed exchange rate. And the reason is because the central bank cannot choose to control both the money supply and the exchange rate simultaneously. It can't essentially say or do an act where it increases the money supply and then decides to fix the exchange rate. It can only do one. It can only do one of these things. When you do one, it affects the other. So you can only do one of those things. So this is what we're going to be looking at in our next section. We'll begin with monetary policy.